Near the edge of Tsavo, the patrol moved quietly through the scrub. The day was sinking toward evening, the air cooling after hours of heat, when the sound first reached them. It was not a call that carried strength. It was thinner, broken at the edges. A high, strained cry that came once and then fell silent. The rangers paused. They listened. When it came again, longer this time, each man and woman turned toward the line of old huts that stood half sunken into the ground. No herd had passed through here in years. No signs of people remained, only wood that had cracked with weather and grass grown up to the walls. The sound came from within. Imani, the lead on this patrol, raised her hand and walked forward. The others followed at a slow pace, careful with each step, not rushing toward the noise but holding their movement steady. The cries came again, shorter now, weaker than before. They entered through a doorway stripped of its frame, and the smell inside caught them. Dry dust, wood rot, and something sharper, animal scent, but faint, as though carried only by a body too small to leave its full mark. In the corner, pressed into the shadows between fallen beams, lay the source of the sound. A lion cub, no older than 3 or 4 months, his body sunken at the ribs and his stomach drawn tight against the bone. His fur was dull with dust, his eyes half closed. He gave a soft cry once more when they came into sight, then rested his head back onto the ground. He did not move to rise. He did not even turn away. The stillness in his body was heavier than the sound had been. One ranger lowered to her knees, watching his chest. It lifted only shallowly, each breath breaking into a faint rattle at the end. She whispered his condition plainly: too small, too thin, too weak to last if left here. The others nodded. There was no sign of a mother, no prints of a lioness circling the huts, no drag of a kill to suggest he had been brought food. He had been here alone, and from the dust beneath him, perhaps for more than a day. If he was not moved now, he would not see another night. The risk was clear. If they touched him too quickly, his frail body could fail from shock. If they waited too long, his strength would run out before they reached the vehicle. Imani signaled for the team to prepare slowly. A blanket was pulled from a pack, unfolded with both hands and lowered into the dirt. They shifted closer, inch by inch, until the ranger's hand hovered only an arm's length from the cub. He made no attempt to pull away. His head lifted once, his mouth opened, but no sound came. He dropped his head again, and his body gave a small shiver. The decision had to be made. Leave him, and he would die where he lay. Lift him, and at least he had a chance. Imani gave a single nod. The ranger closest slid the blanket beneath his body. At first, there was no resistance at all, only the light weight of a cub whose muscles had already given out. Then, as the blanket folded over him, he pushed once weakly against the fabric, a paw pressing against air before dropping back again. That single gesture was all he had left. They raised him slowly. His body sagged in the cloth, head hanging to the side, eyes half shut. One of the rangers pressed a hand to his side, feeling the thin movement of his ribs, counting the rise and fall. Still breathing, but shallow, still alive, but close. They stepped out of the hut together, the cub carried between them, his body so light that 2 hands were enough to bear him. The sun outside had fallen lower, and its light caught across his fur, showing the sharp outline of every rib. At the vehicle, they lowered him onto another blanket spread across the floor. His legs folded in awkwardly, his paws too thin for his frame, his tail barely flicking once before going still. A small sound left his throat. Not a growl, not a full cry, only a broken note. A ranger knelt beside him and whispered, "Stay," though both knew words were not what held him here. It was the decision they had taken, the act of carrying him from the shadows into the open. The engine started. The cub's ears twitched at the sound but did not lift. His head remained pressed against the cloth, his eyes still closed. Every breath came as a test. each one a reminder of what was at risk. If the journey shook him too hard, his body could falter. If his strength lasted until camp, there would be a chance to keep him alive until morning. As the vehicle pulled onto the dirt track, dust lifted in a pale trail behind them. The rangers sat in silence, eyes fixed on the cub, watching for each movement of his chest. No one spoke of hope, no one promised survival. They simply watched, counted, and understood. If he made it through the next hour, the fight would continue. If not, the sound they had followed into the hut would have been the last he ever gave. The road stretched along before them, each bump reminding them of how fragile he was, each turn holding the weight of his life. And with every breath that came, thin but present, the risk repeated itself in their minds. If they lost him now, he would vanish as quietly as he had been found. The cub lay on the blanket, ribs showing with every shallow breath. His chest rose too fast, then rattled as it fell again. In the dim light of the camp, the rangers watched in silence. A cub his age should have been restless, full of strength, but this one could barely lift his head. He tried once, pressing shaky paws against the tarp, claws scraping faintly. His legs slid out from under him, and his body dropped back hard. His chin struck the ground, his mouth opening as though to cry. But only a dry cough came. The sound was sharp, too small for his frame, and it left him weaker than before. Elian crouched close, steadying the cloth dipped in water. He touched it to the cub's lips. At first, nothing happened. Then the tongue moved, rough and slow, catching a drop. The swallow was faint but real. Another followed, then one more, until the cloth was nearly dry. It was not enough to restore strength, but it was enough to keep him alive for the hour. The cub shifted again, legs trembling as though he meant to stand. He pushed once, shoulders lifting, but his paws slipped, and his chest collapsed to the floor. He gave a low moan, too tired to resist. His ears twitched and then went still. "If he cannot rise, he will not last," Imani said softly. The words carried no force, only truth. Each ranger nodded. The risk was plain. Without nourishment and steady breath, he would not live through the night. If they rushed, his body could fail under the weight of care. If they waited, his strength would vanish before dawn. They tried again with a shallow bowl of water mixed with milk substitute. His nose caught the faint scent. He leaned forward weakly, lapping once before his chin sagged into the rim. Elian steadied the bowl, holding it close until the cub's tongue found it again. He drank a little, swallowing with effort. A line of liquid clung to his fur, and he licked at it until no trace remained. His chest still shook with each breath. His body still shivered against the blanket. The rangers said nothing more, only sat near him, listening. Every sound carried the weight of the choice before them. If his lungs stopped, nothing would bring them back. If he made it through the next hour, there was still a chance. Imani pulled the blanket higher around him. "We try again," she murmured. The night stretched long ahead, each moment holding him on the narrow line between fading and fighting. The cub lay curled on the cloth, breath rattling in the silence. Too small to stand, but not yet ready to stop. Elian lowered to his knees, the dim lamplight throwing soft shadows across the thin body lying on the blanket. The cub had not moved for some time, his chest rising too quickly, each breath rattling as though it caught against bone. The risk of waiting was growing heavier with every minute. If they did not move him now, he would fade where he lay. If they tried too roughly, his body could fail from the strain. He drew a second blanket from the pack. Its edges frayed but clean. Slowly, with both hands steady, he slid the fabric beneath the cub. The body shifted only slightly, a paw twitching once against the ground. Elian paused, waiting for any sign of resistance. None came. The cub's eyes half opened, clouded and tired, then shut again. The others stood close, silent, their eyes fixed on the small life balanced at the edge of survival. Elian folded the blanket over carefully, tucking it just enough to cradle the fragile frame. When the cloth pressed against his side, the cub gave a sound, thin, sharp, almost like a cough. Then he stilled, sinking into the fabric without another struggle. Elian lifted. The weight was shockingly light, more like carrying reeds than a body that should one day grow into strength. The cub's head lolled to the side, his mouth open slightly as though he meant to breathe deeper but could not. Elian adjusted his arms, holding the bundle closer to steady the rise and fall of those faint ribs. Imani watched closely. "Keep him upright," she said softly. Her tone carried no urgency, only measured care. The others nodded. Every small adjustment mattered. If his chest pressed too tightly, the lungs could falter. If his head dropped too far, his airway could close. Every second in Elian's arms was a line between life and silence. The cub stirred once, shifting his body weakly. A paw pressed against the cloth, claws barely visible before falling still again. Elian's hand steadied the blanket, keeping it wrapped without tightening. The movement passed quickly and the cub sagged deeper into the fold, his breathing shallow but present. They carried him toward the shelter's inner space, where warmth and dim quiet would give him a better chance. Each step was slow. The ground was uneven, and even the smallest jolt could weaken him further. Dust rose with their movement, and each time the cub's ears flicked faintly but did not lift. Inside, Elian lowered to the floor again, easing the bundle onto a padded mat. The cub made no new sound, only a faint sigh of air leaving his chest as the blanket was spread around him. His body seemed smaller now, almost disappearing within the folds, a reminder of how much had already been taken from him. The rangers gathered around once more. The decision was complete. He had been lifted from the ground where he was left, carried into hands that now held his chance. If they had left him where he was, he would not have seen the morning. Now, at least, there was a path forward, though it was still narrow. Elian rested one hand lightly on the cub's side, counting again the rise and fall. Still uneven, still weak, but steady for now. The others laid out what little they had: water, cloths, a small pack of milk substitute. None of it was certain, but each piece was a step. For the first time since they had found him, the cub was no longer alone. His sound had faded, his eyes had closed, but his body rested in arms that had chosen not to leave. If he could hold on through the night, his fight would continue. If he faltered, at least it would not be in silence. The night settled heavy across camp, the canvas walls holding a thin warmth against the cooling air. The cub lay bundled in the blanket, his body still, his breath shallow and uneven. The rangers sat close, their movements quiet. Knowing each sound mattered when so much strength had already left him. Elian dipped a cloth into the small bowl of water, squeezing it until it was damp but not dripping. He lowered it carefully to the cub's mouth. At first there was no reaction, only the soft rattle of his breathing. Then the nose twitched, the tongue slid weakly against the fabric, and a drop of water passed into his mouth. It was the smallest swallow, barely visible, but it was real. Elian held steady, touching the cloth again to his lips. The cub licked once more, rough tongue catching the moisture, another swallow following. His chest lifted shallowly, fell again, then repeated. A rhythm, faint but steady, like a thread holding. Imani nodded once, her voice low. "It's reaching him." She did not mean the water alone. She meant the choice they had made, the line they were holding him on. Without it, his lungs would already have stilled. With it, there was a chance. The others took turns with the cloth, patient, each waiting until his tongue moved again before pressing another drop. Sometimes he swallowed, sometimes he let the water slip down his chin, but even those failures left traces of moisture he licked at weakly. It was not enough to restore strength. It was enough to keep the fight inside him. After a while, his breathing slowed slightly, the rattle still there but softer, less frantic. His head sagged against the blanket, eyes closed. A paw shifted once beneath the fabric, a small tremor, then went still. His chest continued its uneven rise and fall. The risk remained. If his lungs collapsed further, nothing could save him. If his body rejected even these drops, his strength would drain before dawn. The Rangers knew it and did not pretend otherwise. They spoke quietly, sharing only short words. Again. Wait. Now. Their calm was not indifference. It was the only way to keep the moment steady. The bowl emptied and was filled again. Hours passed this way, marked only by the slow rhythm of offering water, waiting for a swallow, and watching his chest for each fragile rise. The camp held its silence around him. Even the night insects seemed distant, their sounds softened beyond the walls. Near midnight, the cub shifted once more. His mouth opened and a faint sound left him. Not a cry, but a thin hum of air, broken before it carried. Then he settled again, the effort leaving him still. Elian laid a hand across his side. The ribs moved beneath his palm, weak, shallow, but not stopping. Amani drew the blanket tighter around his body. Enough for tonight, she said quietly. They had given what they could without forcing more than he could take. Now the decision rested with his body. If the water held him through the hours ahead, he would greet another sunrise. If not, his fight would end in the same silence that had nearly taken him inside the hut. The Rangers leaned back, eyes still fixed on him, waiting. The cub breathed on, each rattle softer than the last. It was not strength, not yet, but it was life. For this night, that was enough. Dawn stretched pale across the camp, a soft light spilling over the acacia trees as the Rangers stirred from a night of broken rest. The cub still lay curled within the folds of the blanket, his breathing shallow but steady, his body warmer now beneath the fabric. Elian checked him once more, pressing fingers lightly to his side. The ribs still rose and fell, uneven yet present. Survival had not been won, but the night had not taken him. Then a sound carried faintly through the morning stillness. It was not the thin, high cry they had followed into the hut. This one was softer, lower, strained as though pulled from deeper within a chest. The Rangers froze, each head turning toward the line of scrub that edged the abandoned huts. The sound came again, weak but clear enough to mark its direction. Imani rose first, scanning the ground near camp. He was not alone, she said quietly. The words shifted the weight of the morning. Until now, the cub in their care had seemed a solitary survivor. The cry beyond the huts meant another, wounded, hidden, or waiting. They set out slowly, leaving 2 Rangers to watch the cub while Elian and Imani followed the sound. The grass at the edge of the clearing showed signs they had missed in the night. Bent stalks pressed into the soil, a faint path winding into the brush. Elian knelt, tracing the marks with his hand. They were not deep, too small to belong to a lioness, too uneven to be the steady tracks of a herd. They looked like prints from another cub, lighter but wandering. The cry came again, shorter now. Both Rangers moved forward, careful not to break too quickly through the grass. Each step revealed more signs. Snapped stems, disturbed dust, a trail that wove without direction. It was the path of something that had stumbled, not hunted. The brush thinned into a small hollow scattered with thorn. At first there was only silence, the early wind carrying no sound but the hiss of dry leaves. Then the cry rose once more, close this time, followed by the faint rustle of movement. Elian lifted a hand, and they waited. From beneath the thorn, a shape stirred, small, thin, and trembling. Another cub, nearly the same size as the first, crawled weakly into the light. His fur was patchy with dust, his eyes half closed. He gave the cry again, head lifting for a moment before sagging low. His body shook with the effort, each step forward collapsing into the soil before another began. Imani's breath caught, but she spoke only in fact. "If he stays here, he will die." The risk was as plain as it had been with the first. Alone, too weak to hunt, too small to defend himself, the cub had survived only by lying hidden. Now his strength was nearly gone. Elian stepped forward, moving low to the ground. The cub did not flee. He only shivered once, gave a faint cough, and stayed where he was. Elian unrolled the second blanket from his shoulder, laying it open across the grass. He eased closer, arms steady, and when he reached the cub, he lifted him gently into the fold. The cub let out one short sound, half protest, half exhaustion, then went still, eyes closing. Carrying him back through the grass, Elian felt the same shocking lightness he had with the first. Both cubs were more fragile than they should have been, their bodies too thin, their lives balanced at the same narrow edge. When they returned to camp, the others widened the blanket already laid out and set the second cub beside the first. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the first stirred, lifting his head weakly. His nose pressed against the new arrival, and the two bodies settled together, fur brushing against fur. Their breathing, though still ragged, seemed to fall into rhythm. The rangers exchanged quiet glances, the truth clear to all. They had not rescued one cub alone. They had found a pair bound by survival, each carrying the same risk, each now dependent on the same fragile care. If they failed, both would be lost. If they succeeded, both would rise. The sun had risen higher by the time the second cub lay settled against his sibling, both pressed together in the thin warmth of the blanket. The rangers kept their distance, letting the pair rest. But the question lingered heavy between them. Two cubs this young could not have survived long without a mother. If she was not dead, then she was close. And if she was close, she would not have left them willingly. Imani motioned for Elian and one other to follow. They left camp quietly, stepping back toward the brush where the second cub had been found. The ground was clearer now in the morning light. Tracks marked the soil, larger this time, broad and steady at first before growing shallow and dragging. Lioness prints. The spacing told its own story. She had walked with strength once, then slowed, then nearly collapsed with each stride. The trail led them beyond the thorn hollow, down a narrow line of grass that sloped toward a dry gully. The air was still, no movement but the flick of insects rising from disturbed stalks. Then Elian stopped, lifting a hand. Ahead, in the shallow bed of the gully, a shape lay stretched across the earth. Tawny fur, ribs rising faintly, head resting flat against the ground. They moved no closer at first, only watching. Her sides lifted with effort, each breath long and uneven. When Elian stepped forward another pace, the lioness stirred. Her head lifted slowly, heavy with exhaustion, and her eyes opened just enough to see them. There was no growl, no bared teeth. She only held her gaze for a moment, then lowered her head again. Imani's voice was quiet, steady. "She cannot rise." The truth was clear in every line of the lioness's body. Her muscles had wasted down to bone, her shoulders sharp, her haunches hollow. Hunger had driven her to the edge, and thirst had anchored her there. Still, she had not left. She had stayed within reach of her cubs, though she no longer had the strength to bring them food or shield them with force. Elian unrolled the cloth from his shoulder, but he did not move closer yet. To press too fast could drain what little energy she had left. He watched her chest rise again, slower this time, then fall with a shudder. When the sound of the cubs carried faintly from camp, a weak cough, followed by the soft moan of breath, the lioness stirred once more. Her head lifted, ears twitching, eyes narrowing. Elian looked back at Imani. She nodded. He shifted, careful and measured, and when he returned a few minutes later he carried the first cub in the same worn blanket. The lioness lifted her head again as they approached. this time her eyes fixed not on the ranger but on the bundle in his arms. When Elian stopped a few paces away, the cub gave a small sound, thin, broken, but recognizable. The lioness pulled in a breath that shook her whole frame. She did not rise, but she pushed her chin from the ground, nostrils flaring once. Elian set the cub down on the edge of the blanket, still holding one corner. The cub stirred, crawling forward with trembling legs until his nose touched her fur. The lioness lowered her head, licked once across his back, then sagged again, the effort draining what little she had left. Elian pulled the blanket back and waited. The cub remained pressed against her chest, body curling into the shallow rise of her ribs. Her eyes closed, her breath still weak, but her presence certain. The rangers stood in silence. They did not need to speak the truth aloud. The cubs had not been abandoned. Their mother had been here all along, too weak to move but unwilling to leave. Her body carried the same risk as theirs. If she did not gain strength soon, she would fail. If she held on, she would give them the bond they needed most. The decision now stretched beyond saving two fragile cubs. It had become the fight to keep a family alive. The gully held its silence as the rangers stood back. Dust shifted in the morning breeze, carrying the faint smell of dry earth, but nothing else moved. The lioness remained stretched along the ground, her sides lifting unevenly, her body too thin to rise. Yet the moment her cub was placed within reach, the space between life and loss narrowed. The cub staggered forward, his legs shaking as though the weight of his own body might pull him down. Each step was uncertain, paws slipping slightly on the loose soil. But he pressed on, driven by something deeper than strength. When he reached her, he collapsed into the hollow of her chest, burying himself against her ribs. His head rested there, eyes closed, the sound of her rough breath rising beneath him. The lioness stirred with effort. Her tongue dragged slowly across his head, a single heavy lick that left his fur darkened. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of survival. She had no strength to roar, no energy to rise and shield him, but she gave what she could, the bond of recognition, the reassurance of her presence. Elian and Imani exchanged quiet glances but did not move closer. They knew the limits. If they crowded her now, even in weakness, her instinct might turn against them. If they lingered too near, she could spend what little she had in panic. The risk was clear. Their role was not to claim the moment, but to give space for it to hold. The cub's body shifted faintly, a small sound leaving his throat. Not the sharp cry of fear, but a softer hum, more like the breath of sleep. His paws twitched against her skin, pressing into her fur as though anchoring himself. The lioness lowered her head further, her chin resting against the curve of his back. Her eyes closed, her ribs rising with effort but now steadier, as if the presence of her cub eased the weight she carried. Behind them, the second cub stirred in Elian's blanket, his body turning as though drawn toward the sound. Imani stepped back, motioning for him to be brought forward as well. When the second cub was laid on the ground, he too stumbled toward her, weaker even than his brother, but still moving. He collapsed beside the first, pressing his nose into her side. The lioness gave another long breath, her head lifting just enough to lick once more. Slow, dragging, a mark of recognition spread across them both. Then she sank again, the effort stealing the last of her strength. Her chest rose, fell, rose again, but her body stayed still. The rangers spoke quietly, their words carrying only fact. If she does not feed, she will fail. If she fails, the cubs cannot survive. The truth sat heavy in the air. They could bring water, they could bring shade, but they could not replace the bond that had just unfolded in front of them. Without her, the cubs would grow weaker by the hour. With her, even fragile, they had a chance. Elian stepped back further, lowering his hands. "Let them stay," he said softly. The others agreed with silence. It was not a choice of strategy, but of respect. In this moment, her presence mattered more than any intervention they could provide. The gully grew quiet again. The cubs pressed against her chest, their bodies rising and falling with the rhythm of her shallow breath. She did not move again, only lay with them, tucked against her tongue having given the only strength she had left. The rangers watched, knowing the stakes had sharpened into a single line. If she endured, so would they. If she slipped away, all 3 lives would vanish with her. By dusk, the decision had been made. The lioness could not remain in the gully. Her body was too thin, her strength too fragile to survive another night without shelter or care. The cubs, pressed tightly against her, had shown signs of life but no promise of endurance. If the rangers left them here, all 3 would likely fade before morning. Moving them was a risk, but it was the only path forward. The team worked quietly, preparing a canvas stretcher and lining it with blankets. Every motion was slow, respectful, no voice raised above a murmur. Elian and Amani moved first, stepping close to the lioness. Her eyes opened faintly, tracking them without fear, only exhaustion. When they slid the stretcher alongside her body, she gave no protest. Her head lifted once, ears twitching, then fell back against the earth. With measured care, they drew the blanket beneath her frame. Her ribs pressed sharply against the cloth, her paws dangling, but she did not resist. The cubs whimpered as her body shifted. One gave a thin cry, staggering to climb onto the stretcher beside her. The other followed, pressing against her chest once more. The lioness lowered her chin, touching it softly to their backs, a final gesture before her strength sagged again. The rangers lifted together. The weight was uneven, too heavy at her shoulders, too light at her haunches, but they bore it with steady steps. Dust rose under their boots, and every jolt sent a tremor through the stretcher. Yet the lioness remained still, her sides lifting and falling, her cubs curled against her without moving away. The trail back to camp stretched long, but each stride brought them closer to safety. When they reached the vehicle, the stretcher was set gently inside. Canvas flaps were pulled low to block the fading sun, and water was placed within reach. The cubs stirred once, lapping weakly from a cloth, then settled back into their mother's side. She turned her head, slow and heavy, eyes half closed. No growl came, no panic, only the faint trust of one who had nothing left to give but presence. The drive back carried its own tension. Every bump risked too much, every turn threatened to break the fragile calm. Yet, as the miles passed, the cubs remained pressed against her chest, their breaths sinking with hers. The rangers sat in silence, eyes fixed on the stretcher, each aware that what survived inside the vehicle was more fragile than anything they had carried before. At camp, they lowered the stretcher beneath a wide acacia where canvas had been strung for shade. The lioness was eased onto the ground, her cubs still clinging close. One shifted, nose pressing against her ribs, and for the first time his small body relaxed fully into sleep. The second followed, curling tight against her side. Their breathing softened. No longer frantic, but quiet, steady with hers. Imani stepped back, brushing dust from her hands. "Alive," she said simply. It was not victory, not certainty, only fact. For this moment, they had kept the line from breaking. What would come tomorrow, no one could know. But the family lay together, and that was enough. The rangers lingered a while longer, checking water, securing the shade. Then, when all was still, they left. The lioness did not rise to watch them go. The cubs did not stir from their place against her. The camp grew quiet again, the evening light spilling across the ground. As the team walked back toward their tents, the image remained fixed in their minds. A mother too weak to stand, her cubs pressed against her, alive because she had stayed, alive because they had carried her. The silence held its own weight, but it was not empty. It was the silence of survival, fragile and real, carried with them long after the day was done.